the story does not begin with learning. It begins with mastery. When the Great Pyramid enters the historical record, it does so without hesitation, without visible uncertainty, without the awkward fingerprints of a civilization still figuring things out. It arrives already complete, geometrically confident, structurally stable, and disturbingly precise. According to conventional chronology, this structure rose around 2550 BCE, during Egypt's Fourth Dynasty, and was completed in roughly 20 years. That figure, often repeated, sounds impressive until it is translated into something more concrete. More than 2 million stone blocks set in place, which means that, on average, a block was quarried, transported, positioned, and fitted every few minutes, continuously, for 2 decades. This is where the discomfort begins. Not in the stones themselves, but in the speed, the coordination, and the absence of visible struggle. Human beings do not usually build like this. We experiment, we fail. We leave behind awkward beginnings, collapsed walls, abandoned techniques, half-successful prototypes that teach hard lessons. Every major leap in engineering carries with it a visible trail of mistakes. You can see this in bridges, in ships, in cathedrals, in modern skyscrapers. Early attempts are clumsy. Later ones improve. Mastery is earned slowly, across generations. But the Great Pyramid does not look like something learned. It looks like something remembered. Before it, Egyptian architecture was dominated by mastabas, rectangular tombs built from mud brick or simple stone. They were functional, understandable, grounded in practical needs. They show no hint of internal complexity, no extreme precision, no advanced astronomical orientation. Then, within the span of a single dynasty, this architectural language vanishes, replaced by a structure that seems to belong to an entirely different conversation, one involving large-scale geometry, celestial alignment, and material control at a level that later generations never quite recover. And that is the second anomaly. The one that refuses to sit quietly. Everything that comes after the Great Pyramid is, by comparison, diminished. Later, pyramids are smaller. Their stones are less carefully fitted. Their internal chambers crack or collapse. Builders begin to rely on smaller blocks, rubble, fill, and mortar to maintain structural integrity. The techniques do not refine, they degrade. Precision fades. Scale retreats. The timeline bends in the wrong direction. This is not how progress is supposed to look. If the Great Pyramid were the culmination of Egyptian experimentation, then we should see its roots clearly laid out before it transitional forms that gradually approach its sophistication. Methods that improve incrementally, techniques that are tested, refined, and perfected. Instead, the architectural record feels compressed, as though a complete solution was applied suddenly and then slowly forgotten. The stones themselves seem to sense this inversion. Their surfaces meet so tightly that a blade cannot be slipped between them. Their weights sometimes exceeding 70 tons demands logistics and planning that would challenge even modern infrastructure. Yet no visible scaffolding systems remain, no ramps preserved, no clear blueprint explaining how such feats were achieved. What remains is only the result, perfectly executed, silent about the process. Silence, in this context, is not empty, it is heavy. When engineers study the Great Pyramid today, they do not speak of primitive effort. They speak of tolerances, of load distribution, of choices that suggest foresight rather than improvisation. The structure behaves less like an experiment and more like a final draft. And this is what unsettles the narrative, because civilizations do not normally begin with final drafts. They begin with rough sketches. The conventional explanation asks us to believe that Fourth Dynasty Egypt experienced a brief, almost miraculous convergence of insight mastering geometry, astronomy, logistics, and large-scale stoneworking within a few decades only, to lose that mastery almost immediately afterward. The same culture, with access to the same quarries, the same labor force, and the same motivation, could no longer replicate what it had just achieved. Knowledge appears, peaks, and vanishes. This pattern does not resemble invention, it resembles inheritance. Inherited knowledge behaves differently from discovered knowledge. It can be applied without being fully understood. It can be executed faithfully while its underlying principles remain opaque. And when the chain of transmission breaks, when the last generation that truly understands the method disappears, the form can persist even as the essence dissolves. The Great Pyramid feels like the opening scene of such a story, a monument standing at the threshold, not marking the beginning of an idea, but the moment an idea was last fully expressed. Everything that follows feels like an echo attempts to repeat a form whose deeper logic is no longer accessible. This does not diminish the Egyptians. If anything, it complicates them. It suggests a civilization that recognized the importance of what it possessed, even if it could not entirely recreate it. A culture that chose continuity over reinvention, ritual over innovation, preservation over explanation. And this brings us to the central tension that will guide everything that follows. The question is not whether the Egyptians built the pyramids in the physical sense. Inscriptions, burial practices, and later usage make it clear that they did. The question is whether they originated the knowledge that made the earliest pyramids possible, or whether they inherited something already ancient, something complete enough to be used, but fragile enough to be lost. The Great Pyramid stands at the start of recorded Egyptian monumentality, but it behaves like a conclusion, a solved equation written in stone, with no visible calculations left behind. The ground beneath it holds its weight effortlessly, as though it was prepared for exactly this purpose. The stones above it fit as if they were meant to be there, long before anyone wrote a king's name upon them. And so the mystery does not ask us to leap into fantasy. It asks us to slow down, to notice the order in which things appear, to listen to the silence where trial and error should be, to accept that sometimes the most revealing clue is not what a civilization tells us, but what it never explains. Because mastery does not usually appear without memory, and memory does not usually vanish without leaving a trace. Yet here, at the very beginning of Egypt's most iconic achievement, we are faced with something that looks less like the dawn of learning, and more like the fading light of something already old. If the Great Pyramid were an opening chapter, what follows should read like refinement. Instead, it reads like erosion. Move forward in time, away from the Fourth Dynasty, and the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Pyramids continue to be built, yes, but each one seems to carry less certainty than the last. The stone blocks grow smaller, the joints loosen. Mortar begins to appear, not as an aesthetic choice, but as a structural necessity. Internal chambers crack. Some collapse entirely. Others survive only as skeletal cores, their outer casing long since fallen away. This is not the story of a technology finding its footing. It is the story of a technology losing its grip. In the 5th and 6th dynasties, pharaohs still command vast resources. The Nile still floods reliably. Quarries still operate. Labor forces are still organized on a massive scale. Nothing about Egypt's political or material situation suggests sudden incapacity, and yet the pyramids they commission fail to approach the precision or durability of those at Giza. Consider the Pyramid of Unas, built scarcely 2 centuries after the Great Pyramid. It already shows signs of structural weakness. Its interior chambers suffered collapse. The Pyramid of Pepe too, once the tallest of its era, has degraded into a mound of rubble. Builders increasingly rely on rubble cores packed with mortar, a shortcut that sacrifices longevity for speed. These structures do not endure. They decay quickly, sometimes within centuries. This is not how cumulative knowledge behaves. When a civilization truly understands a technique, it does not forget it overnight. Mastery deepens, efficiency improves, complexity increases. Later generations stand on the shoulders of earlier ones, not behind them, squinting at what they can no longer see clearly. Yet Egyptian pyramid construction follows the opposite arc. The earliest examples are the strongest. The later ones are approximations. This inversion is quietly acknowledged even within conventional scholarship. Egyptologists often describe the Fourth Dynasty as a golden age of pyramid building, followed by decline. But gold ages usually imply a peak after long development, not a peak at the very beginning. A golden age that appears without a visible Bronze Age. Beneath it is not an age at all, it is an anomaly. The stones themselves preserve this contradiction. In the Great Pyramid, massive limestone blocks, some weighing tens of tons, are fitted together with such precision that the structure behaves as a single mass. Stress is distributed evenly. Weak points are minimized. The pyramid settles, but it does not fail. In later pyramids, the stonework grows cruder. Blocks vary in size. Gaps are filled rather than eliminated. Structural coherence gives way to patchwork solutions. This suggests a shift not in ambition, but in understanding. Later builders clearly knew what a pyramid was supposed to look like. They understood its symbolic importance. They copied its shape, its orientation, its basic layout. What they struggled with was the invisible part, the internal logic that made the form stable. They remembered the answer, but not the equation. This distinction matters. When knowledge is invented, it tends to be refined. When knowledge is inherited, it can be used effectively for a time, even by those who do not fully grasp it. But inheritance without comprehension is fragile. Once the original context is lost, what remains is repetition without insight. Imagine being handed a complex machine with instructions written in a language you do not speak. You can observe how it operates. You can imitate its movements. You might even use it successfully for years. But when it breaks, or when you try to improve it, you are limited by what you do not understand. Over time, the machine becomes simpler, less efficient, more prone to failure, not because you are incapable, but because the original knowledge that shaped it is gone. The Egyptian pyramids feel like monuments caught in this exact process. What makes this especially troubling is the speed of the decline. Within a few generations, builders lose access to techniques that allowed the placement of massive stones without mortar, the creation of internal chambers that remained stable for millennia, and the execution of geometry so precise that modern engineers still study it with admiration. The loss is not gradual across 1,000 years, it is abrupt. This suggests that the chain of transmission was short. If the knowledge behind the Great Pyramid were fully embedded in Egyptian institutions, taught in schools, recorded in manuals, reinforced through constant experimentation, it would not vanish so quickly. Its disappearance implies that it may have resided in a small group of specialists, or in a tradition that was already old by the time Egypt adopted it. When those specialists died, or when that tradition fractured, the knowledge went with them. What remains, then, is not progress, but ritual. Later pyramids look correct from a distance. They fulfill the symbolic expectations of kingship and afterlife. They face the cardinal directions. They rise with familiar slopes. But beneath the surface, they lack the coherence of their predecessors. They are monuments to memory rather than understanding, forms preserved because they mattered, not because they were fully grasped. And this is where the pattern sharpens. The decline is not limited to pyramids alone. Across Egyptian architecture and material culture, the earliest examples often display a level of craftsmanship that later periods never quite recover. Precision fades, techniques simplify, complexity gives way to practicality. This is not the arc of invention, it is the arc of loss. If the Great Pyramid represents a technological peak rather than a beginning, then the question becomes unavoidable. Peaks do not rise from flat ground. They are the culmination of something that came before something we no longer see. And if later Egyptians could not replicate what their ancestors built, despite having every incentive and resource to do so, then perhaps what they inherited was never fully theirs to begin with. Perhaps they were working from a legacy that arrived already mature, already optimized, and already slipping beyond reach. Progress does not usually move backward, but inheritance does. And when we look closely at the pyramids that follow Giza, we are not watching a civilization stumble forward into greatness. We are watching it struggle to remember something it once held, briefly, before it began to fade. The deeper you look into the stones of Giza, the less they seem to belong to their time. Not symbolically, physically. Some of the limestone blocks in the Great Pyramid weigh more than 20 tons. Others, especially those used in the king's chamber and its relieving spaces, are carved from granite and exceed 50 tons. A few approach 70. These stones were not gathered casually. They were quarried miles away, transported across land and river, lifted into place, and fitted with a precision that defies casual explanation. And it is the fitting that quietly unsettles modern observers. The blocks meet without mortar. Their surfaces are ground so flat that light barely passes between them. In some places, the gaps measure less than 0.5 millimeter thinner than a fingernail, thinner than a blade of grass. Under immense pressure, over thousands of years, the stones have not shifted. The structure behaves not like stacked blocks, but like a single, unified mass. This is not brute force. This is control. To achieve this level of precision, stone must be cut with intention, not approximation. Surfaces must be flattened deliberately. Angles must be maintained consistently across thousands of repetitions. Errors must be detected and corrected before they compound. This requires tools. Yes, but more importantly, it requires method. And method leaves traces. Later, Egyptian stonework does leave traces. Chisel marks, abrasion lines, irregular surfaces smoothed only where visible. These marks tell a story of effort, of gradual shaping, of techniques that can be seen and understood. But in the core stonework of Giza, those traces are often absent. Surfaces are smooth beyond what copper tools alone are thought capable of producing. Drill holes in hard stone show spiral striations, suggesting controlled rotary motion rather than simple pounding. Saw cuts through granite appear straight and consistent over lengths that imply sustained pressure and effective abrasives. None of this proves the use of impossible technology, but it does prove something else. It proves that the methods were refined. Refinement implies repetition. It implies trial, error, and adjustment over time. Yet the archaeological record offers no long sequence of failed attempts leading up to this point. The stonework does not look like the first time such methods were tried. It looks like the 100th. What makes this even more puzzling is what comes afterward. In later periods, Egyptian builders clearly struggle to reproduce these effects. Granite is used less often. When it is used, it is worked more roughly. Corners soften. Surfaces lose their mirror-like polish. Tool marks become visible again, as though techniques once capable of erasing their own traces have slipped out of reach. The oldest stone vessels tell the same story. Pre-dynastic bowls and jars carved from diorite, one of the hardest stones available, display walls of uniform thickness, perfectly centered interiors, and surfaces polished to a reflective sheen. Modern stoneworkers have attempted to replicate these objects using rotary tools and abrasives, often with limited success. Later, dynastic examples, made centuries afterward, are thicker, asymmetrical, and visibly worked. Again, the curve runs backward. If Egyptian stoneworking techniques were evolving, the finest examples should come later, not earlier. Yet time and again, the earliest pieces appear to embody the highest level of skill. Later, artisans imitate the forms, but not the mastery. This suggests that something fundamental was lost. Stone does not forgive ignorance. It preserves evidence of both skill and limitation. You can hide mistakes in mud brick. You can patch flaws with mortar. But when you work with multi-ton blocks of granite and limestone, every decision leaves a permanent record. The Great Pyramid's stones do not show the hesitation of novices. They show the confidence of those who already knew exactly what they were doing. And confidence like this rarely appears in isolation. It is tempting to imagine vast armies of laborers, endless time, and sheer persistence overcoming any obstacle. But persistence alone does not explain precision. You can stack stones for decades, and still never achieve tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. Accuracy requires standards. Standards require understanding. Understanding requires transmission. So where is the trail? Where are the workshops filled with failed granite experiments? Where are the abandoned quarries showing gradual improvement in technique? Where are the intermediate objects that bridge the gap between rough stone and flawless finish? They are not absent because they were destroyed. They are absent because they may never have existed in Egypt at all. This does not mean the Egyptians were incapable. It means they may have received a finished tradition rather than developing one from scratch. A set of techniques already optimized, already tested elsewhere, brought into Egypt and applied at a moment when conditions allowed it to be fully expressed. And when those conditions changed, when the last masters died, when training chains broke, when knowledge shifted from practice to ritual, the techniques faded. What remained were echoes, forms without function, stones shaped by hands that remembered the goal but not the path. The Great Pyramid's stones do not announce their mystery loudly. They simply sit where they were placed, unmoved, unimpressed by time, indifferent to explanation. Their surfaces still meet perfectly. Their mass still distributes itself exactly as intended. They continue to perform a task they were designed to perform, long after the people who used them stopped understanding how. This is the unsettling quality of Giza's stonework. It does not feel experimental. It feels final. And final things usually come at the end of a story, not the beginning. There is precision, and then there is obsession. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north with an accuracy that still unsettles modern surveyors. Its northern face deviates by only a few arc minutes, mere fractions of a single degree. This is not magnetic north, which drifts over time and can be found with a simple compass. This is true north, fixed by the axis of the Earth itself, discoverable only through sustained astronomical observation and careful correction. To find true north without modern instruments, you must watch the sky patiently. You must track the slow rotation of circumpolar stars, mark their positions night after night, bisect arcs, correct for error, and do so consistently enough that small inaccuracies do not accumulate into large ones. This is not guesswork. It is methodical, time-consuming, and unforgiving. And the pyramid does not merely approximate this alignment, it locks onto it. Why would a tomb require such precision? Later, Egyptian temples are also aligned to celestial events. They greet the rising sun on solstices. They track the heliocal rising of Sirius, tied to the flooding of the Nile and the agricultural year. These alignments are meaningful, symbolic, deeply woven into religious life. But they are not exact in the way Giza is exact. Their tolerances are broader. Their purpose is ritual, not measurement. The Great Pyramid behaves differently. Its alignment feels less like symbolism and more like calibration. This impression deepens when geometry enters the picture. The proportions of the pyramid encode relationships that resonate with fundamental mathematical constants. The ratio of the pyramid's perimeter to its height closely approximates to linking a square base to the geometry of a circle. Whether this was intentional or emergent remains debated, but the consistency of the proportions suggests deliberation rather than coincidence. These are not decorative choices, they are structural decisions. Geometry at this level requires abstraction. It requires thinking beyond immediate utility and into relationships that describe space itself. It demands an understanding of proportion that can be applied repeatedly across millions of stones without deviation. Such thinking does not usually appear suddenly in a culture with no visible preparatory stages, and then there is placement. The Great Pyramid sits near the 30th parallel north, a latitude of geometric significance, one-third of the distance between the equator and the pole. Some researchers have noted that its location also approximates the center of Earth's landmass distribution, a point where continental area radiates outward with remarkable balance. Whether intentional or coincidental, the placement is mathematically curious. Curiosity alone does not imply purpose. But when alignment, proportion, and location converge, coincidence begins to feel strained. To choose such a site deliberately would require knowledge of the Earth as a sphere, an understanding of latitude, and some method of large-scale surveying. It would require long-term observation and record-keeping that spans generations. The Fourth Dynasty, by conventional reckoning, lasted barely more than a century. That is not much time to develop a global framework of measurement from nothing. Once again, the pattern repeats. The knowledge appears complete. It is applied with confidence, and then it fades. Later pyramids are still oriented toward cardinal directions, but the accuracy slips. Later monuments still engage the sky, but with broader margins. The obsession with exactness gives way to approximation. The why behind the alignment seems to recede, leaving only the instruction that alignment matters. Ritual preserves fragments. Meaning erodes. It is possible, of course, that the Great Pyramid's precision was achieved through extraordinary effort, once-in-a-millennium convergence of talent, motivation, and luck. But luck does not usually encode mathematics into stone. An effort alone does not explain why such precision was never surpassed. Even when later builders had the pyramid itself standing before them as a reference. If the alignment techniques were understood, they could have been repeated. If the geometry were grasped, it could have been refined. Instead, later generations imitate the outline without replicating the exactness. They know where to point the structure, but not how sharply. This suggests that the alignment was not merely a ritual requirement, but a functional one important enough to be executed precisely, but whose purpose was no longer fully understood by those who inherited it. When function becomes opaque, it often becomes sacred. Sacred things are preserved, not questioned. The sky still moves overhead, indifferent to our interpretations. The stars still trace their ancient paths, and the pyramid remains fixed, its edges pointing where they were meant to point, its proportions holding relationships that do not decay. Stone remembers what explanation forgets. If the Great Pyramid's alignment exceeds the needs of burial and symbolism, then it may have served a purpose tied to measurement, calibration, or knowledge preservation. A role that demanded exactness because error would render it meaningless. A role that assumed continuity across time builders, working not just for a king, but for an unknown future. Such thinking implies experience. It implies memory of loss. Cultures that expect knowledge to endure do not encode it in stone. They write books. They teach students. They build institutions. But cultures that have seen knowledge vanish, burned, flooded, forgotten begin to think differently. They seek permanence. They seek structures that cannot be easily erased. If the builders of Giza understood something about cycles about collapse, forgetting, and renewal, then aligning a monument with the sky and embedding mathematics into its form becomes less mysterious. It becomes precaution. The Great Pyramid does not simply face north. It fixes itself to the world, and in doing so, it quietly asks a question that grows more unsettling with each observation. If this level of precision was not necessary for a tomb, and if it was never fully replicated again, then who needed it and why? Long before the first stone was lifted, the ground was already speaking. Beneath the pyramids lies not an empty stage, but a surface that bears the memory of forces older than dynasties. The Giza Plateau is not a naturally flat expanse of desert. It is shaped, leveled in places, carved and adjusted with intention. Bedrock has been cut back, trenches carved, channels shaped. This is not the casual result of erosion. It is preparation, and preparation implies foresight. The question is not whether the Egyptians worked the plateau. They did. The question is when that work began and under what conditions. Here geology enters the story, quietly but firmly, with evidence that does not rely on interpretation or myth, but on the slow, patient record left by water. The stone surrounding the Sphinx enclosure shows deep vertical erosion patterns. These are not the shallow, horizontal striations produced by wind and sand in an arid climate. They are the signature of sustained rainfall water flowing down exposed rock surfaces over long periods of time. This distinction matters because Egypt's dynastic period, beginning around 3100 BCE, was already dry. Rainfall was minimal. The Sahara was a desert, but it was not always so. Between roughly 9000 and 5500 BCE, North Africa experienced what climatologists call the African humid period. The Sahara was green. Rivers ran where sand now lies. Lakes dotted the landscape. Rainfall was regular, sometimes heavy. The Nile carried greater volume. The world around Giza looked nothing like the barren plateau we see today. If the erosion patterns around the Sphinx reflect prolonged exposure to rain, then the stone must have been exposed during that wetter era. Not encased, not protected, exposed, which means that parts of the plateau were shaped, weathered, and left open to the elements thousands of years before the pyramids were raised above them. This does not prove that the pyramids themselves are older than dynastic Egypt. It suggests something subtler and perhaps more unsettling, that the ground on which they stand was already worked, already prepared, already meaningful. Stone remembers even when texts forget. Subsurface surveys deepen this impression. Ground-penetrating radar and seismic studies beneath the plateau have revealed anomalies forwards, cavities, linear features that do not correspond neatly to known natural formations. Some are rectangular, some appear deliberately aligned, others lie beneath structures whose official dates place them millennia later. Conventional explanations often attribute these features to natural fissures or later modifications, and some of them may well be, but the regularity of certain patterns and their placement beneath carefully planned monuments raises questions that remain unanswered. No comprehensive excavation has been conducted to settle the matter. The ground holds its secrets quietly. What we are left with is context. The Giza Plateau was not chosen at random. It sits on stable bedrock. It rises above the floodplain. It commands a clear view of the sky. These qualities alone would have made it attractive. But the evidence suggests more than selection. It suggests recognition, as though the site was already known, already valued, long before the Fourth Dynasty claimed it. If that is the case, then the act of building the pyramids becomes less about discovery and more about continuation. The Egyptians may have inherited not just techniques, but locations, places, whose significance was established in an older world, under different skies, in a different climate. This possibility reframes the timeline. Instead of compressing all activity into a few decades of frenetic labor, it spreads human interaction with the plateau across millennia. The heavy rainfall shapes the stone. Human hands level and carve the bedrock. Time passes. Climate shifts. The land dries. Sand advances. And then, much later, a civilization arrives that recognizes the value of what lies beneath and builds upon it. Preparation does not require completion. Intention does not require immediate execution. It is entirely possible for a culture to begin work it will never finish, to shape a foundation for a future it cannot imagine. And it is equally possible for a later culture to inherit that foundation without knowing who first laid hands upon it. The ground beneath Giza does not announce its age loudly. It does not offer names or dates. It offers texture, pattern, memory, etched slowly by water and time. These marks do not tell us who prepared the plateau. They tell us that someone did dand, that they did so under conditions that no longer exist. If the bedrock bears the scars of rain, and if that rain fell long before dynastic Egypt, then the story of Giza does not begin with pharaohs. It begins earlier, in a greener world, when the desert was not yet a desert, and when the idea of preparing stone for the future may have made a different kind of sense. This is not a conclusion. It is a widening of the frame. The pyramids rise from the plateau, but the plateau itself rises from a deeper past. And whatever shaped it did so with patience, with planning, and with an understanding of stone that would later be echoed but never quite repeated. The ground remembers an older world, and the pyramids stand on top of that memory, silent witnesses to a history that began before history knew how to write. If the stones speak in weight and alignment, the texts speak in absence. Ancient Egypt was not a quiet civilization. It wrote constantly. Scribes recorded grain deliveries, cattle counts, temple inventories, medical treatments, prayers, legal disputes, personal letters, even shopping lists. Tomb walls preserve autobiographies of minor officials in astonishing detail. Papyrus scrolls catalogue rituals, calculate areas, diagnose injuries, and prescribe remedies. Few ancient cultures documented themselves so obsessively, so carefully, so completely. And yet, amid this vast ocean of words, there is a striking silence. There is no manual explaining how to build a pyramid, no architectural treatise describing slope angles or internal chamber design, no diagrams showing how multi-ton blocks were cut, transported, lifted, and set with such precision. No step-by-step explanation of how granite was drilled, sawn, or polished to mirror smoothness. No written account of how the Great Pyramid was aligned to true north with obsessive accuracy. Nothing. This silence is not partial. it is total. For smaller projects, instructions survive. Sketches and measurements appear for modest temples and tomb renovations. Administrative records describe how materials were gathered and moved. The famous Diary of Mira, discovered near Wadi al-Jarf in 2013, carefully logs the transport of limestone blocks from Tura to Giza during the rain traditionally attributed to the Great Pyramid. It names workers, boats, routes, schedules, but it does not explain why the stones were cut to those dimensions. It does not describe the geometry of the structure. It does not touch the knowledge behind the design. It records logistics, not understanding. This contrast is revealing. Egyptian scribes wrote what they knew. They documented processes that were intellectually accessible, counting, organizing, administering. But the deeper engineering logic behind the pyramids never enters the written tradition. It is as if the most complex achievement of Egyptian civilization existed outside the language system used to preserve knowledge. One explanation is loss. Papyrus is fragile. Fire, moisture, and time destroy documents easily. Perhaps the manuals existed once and simply did not survive. But this argument weakens when placed beside what did survive. Mathematical papyri, copied and recopied for centuries, endured. Medical texts persisted long after their authors died. If pyramid engineering manuals had existed, if they were understood and valued, they would have been preserved, referenced, taught. Instead, later texts never cite them. They never build upon them. They never even mention them. Silence of this kind suggests not destruction, but non-existence. It hints that the knowledge required to design the pyramids was not conceptualized in a way that could be easily written down. It may have been procedural rather than theoretical, transmitted through demonstration and apprenticeship rather than abstract explanation, or it may have predated writing itself. Writing in Egypt emerges around 3200 BCE, shortly before the First Dynasties. The Great Pyramid appears only a few centuries later. If the core principles behind its design belonged to an older tradition, one that developed before writing was formalized, then there would have been no written manuals to lose. The knowledge would have lived in practice, not in text. Practice, however, is fragile. When knowledge is embedded in doing rather than explaining, it depends entirely on continuity. Masters must train apprentices fully. Skills must be passed hand to hand, eye to eye. When that chain breaks, the knowledge vanishes silently, leaving no written trace to recover. This would explain the pattern we see. The Fourth Dynasty executes the design successfully. Later dynasties remember the form, but not the principles. They record what they can: who moved stone, who paid workers, which rituals were performed, but the deeper logic never appears in ink because it was never translated into words. You cannot write a manual for something you do not fully understand. You can only describe the outcome. In this light, the pyramids themselves begin to resemble something else entirely. Not just monuments, but repositories. Not books, but embodiments of knowledge. Their dimensions encode relationships. Their alignment preserves astronomical observations. Their structure demonstrates load-bearing principles that need no explanation because they perform them silently, continuously. Stone becomes the medium because stone does not forget. Later generations could measure the pyramid. They could admire it. They could imitate its shape. But without the conceptual framework that gave rise to those measurements, imitation becomes approximation. Ritual replaces reasoning. Reverence replaces comprehension. This is how silence spreads, not through censorship, but through drift. The scribes wrote what they knew. They were meticulous, honest, thorough. Their silence about pyramid construction is not suspicious in the way a cover-up is suspicious. It is unsettling in a quieter way. It suggests a boundary point beyond which written knowledge could not reach. If the pyramids were built using principles inherited from an earlier time, then the scribes of dynastic Egypt may never have possessed the language to describe them. They inherited the result, not the reasoning. They documented the labor, not the design. And when the last generation capable of executing that design passed away, the knowledge passed with them, leaving behind only stone and silence. Silence, in this context, is not emptiness, it is evidence. It tells us when knowledge stopped being explainable and began being preserved in form instead. And it invites a question that grows more persistent the longer it goes unanswered. If the most literate civilization of the ancient world could not explain its greatest architectural achievement, then perhaps that achievement did not originate within its written tradition at all. Perhaps the pyramids were never meant to be explained. Perhaps they were meant to endure. When Egyptian kings spoke about the monuments of their land, they did not speak like inventors. They spoke like caretakers. Across dynasties, inscriptions repeat a curious pattern. Pharaohs described themselves clearing sand from ancient structures, repairing damage, renewing offerings, restoring what had fallen into neglect. Their language is careful, reverent, and strikingly humble. They do not boast of creating these monuments from nothing. They position themselves as guardians of something already sacred, already old. This tone is difficult to reconcile with the image of bold innovators announcing unprecedented achievements. Take the words of Kamweset, son of Ramesses II, who lived more than 1,000 years after the Great Pyramid was built. He is often called the first Egyptologist, not because he discovered new monuments, but because he sought out old ones. His inscriptions describe searching for forgotten structures, clearing them of debris, and restoring their names so they would not be lost to time. He does not claim authorship, he claims preservation. The same pattern appears earlier. The dream steelly placed between the paws of the Sphinx by Thutmose IV tells a story not of construction, but of neglect and restoration. The young prince dreams that the Sphinx, buried up to its neck in sand, asks to be freed. When Thutmose clears the sand and restores the monument, he is rewarded with kingship. The Sphinx is treated not as a sculpture newly carved by human hands, but as an ancient presence with its own agency and memory. Language matters. If the Sphinx were a recent creation of the Fourth Dynasty, there would be no need for mythic framing. The story would celebrate engineering and royal power. Instead, it frames restoration as an act of piety, not invention. The monument is already ancient enough to demand respect. This attitude extends to the pyramids themselves. Later inscriptions rarely dwell on their construction. They do not explain techniques. They do not glorify innovation. Instead, they emphasize continuity, maintaining cosmic order, honoring what the gods established long before the current ruler's reign. One text from the Temple of Edfu, carved during the Ptolemaic period, describes sacred architecture as having been laid out according to plans that descended from the sky in a primeval age. Kings are portrayed not as designers, but as executors and restorers of an eternal blueprint. The implication is subtle but consistent. Monumental forms are inherited, not invented. This is not how Egyptian kings spoke about their own achievements. When pharaohs conquered foreign lands, they carved their victories into stone in exhaustive detail. When they built temples, they designed themselves. They made sure future generations knew it. Ramesses II covered Egypt with inscriptions proclaiming his greatness, his strength, his divine favor. Egyptian rulers were not shy. They advertised relentlessly. So why the restraint here? Why, when it comes to the pyramids and the oldest monuments of Giza, does the language soften? Why do kings frame themselves as restorers rather than creators. One answer is practical humility. Perhaps the pyramids were so vast, so obviously superior to anything later generations could build, that claiming authorship would invite disbelief. Another answer is cultural honesty. Perhaps by the time later dynasties ruled, the true origins of these monuments were already uncertain. If the knowledge required to build the earliest pyramids had faded, then later rulers would have stood before structures they could not replicate, surrounded by traditions they could not fully explain. In such a situation, claiming invention would ring hollow. Reverence becomes the safer posture. Restoration becomes the nobler act. There is also the curious case of texts that openly suggests inheritance. The Inventory Stele, dated to the 26th Dynasty, describes Khufu discovering the Sphinx and surrounding temples already present, buried in sand. Modern scholars often regard this text as a later fabrication, an attempt by priests to lend greater antiquity to local cults. And it may well be exactly that. But even fabrications reveal beliefs. The fact that such a story could circulate at all tells us something important. By the late period, there was already a tradition widespread enough to be believable that the monuments of Giza predated the kings traditionally credited with them. Whether true or not, this belief did not arise in a vacuum. It emerged from centuries of uncertainty, from a cultural memory that no longer aligned neatly with official timelines. Greek writers encountered this ambiguity as well. When Herodotus visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, he recorded multiple, sometimes contradictory accounts of the pyramid's origins. Egyptian priests spoke of Khufu and Kafir, but they also spoke of older ages, forgotten rulers, and deep time. History, in their telling, was layered, not linear. Even the names of the pyramids reflect this mindset. The Great Pyramid was not simply called the Pyramid Khufu built. It was called Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu. A horizon is not something one creates. It is something one occupies, something one aligns oneself with. The language implies association rather than origin. This distinction is subtle, but it matters. If later Egyptians believed they were stewards rather than creators, then their behavior makes sense. They preserved what they could. They repaired damage. They kept rituals alive. They treated the pyramids as sacred inheritances rather than technological achievements to be surpassed, and they never tried to outdo them. No pharaoh built a pyramid larger or more precise than those at Giza. No dynasty attempted to reclaim the level of stoneworking seen in the Fourth Dynasty. The ambition shifted elsewhere to temples, statues, and inscriptions, forms of expression that relied more on symbolism than structural perfection. This suggests an unspoken recognition that something essential had been lost. In this light, Egyptian greatness takes on a different shape. Not the brilliance of invention, but the wisdom of preservation. They recognized value in what they could not fully understand. They honored monuments that came from a time already distant to them. They ensured continuity when mastery was no longer available. The builders who came later did not invent the pyramids. They protected them. And sometimes, the way a civilization treats its past reveals more than what it claims to have created. There is a quiet law in human history that rarely fails. Techniques improve, tools refine, skill accumulates. And yet, in Egypt, stone tells a different story. When archaeologists place objects side by side across centuries, a strange inversion appears. The oldest examples of stone craftsmanship are often the most precise. Later ones, created with more time, more population, and more institutional continuity, are cruder by comparison. The curve does not rise, it slopes downward. Consider the stone vessels found in pre-dynastic context, bowls and jars carved from diorite, basalt, and granite. These stones are among the hardest available in Egypt. They resist cutting, they punish error, and yet the vessels made from them are astonishing. Their walls are thin and uniform. Their interiors are perfectly centered. Their symmetry is exact. Their surfaces are polished to a reflective sheen so smooth that tool marks vanish entirely. Modern craftsmen, equipped with rotary tools and industrial abrasives, have attempted to reproduce these objects. Many struggle, some fail outright. The difficulty lies not only in shaping the exterior, but in hollowing the interior evenly without cracking the stone, without drifting off center, without leaving marks that betray the method. Now, look forward in time. By the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years later, stone vessels are still being made, but they are thicker, less symmetrical. Tool marks remain visible. The polish is uneven. The stone is often softer, easier to work. The forms echo the earlier masterpieces, but the mastery itself is missing. This pattern repeats across Egyptian material culture. The granite sarcophagus in the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid weighs tens of tons and was carved from a single block, transported hundreds of miles from Aswan. Its interior corners are sharply defined. Its surfaces are flat and true. It fits its space so precisely that even after millennia, it remains structurally sound. No later sarcophagus matches its combination of size, hardness, and precision. Later attempts grow smaller. Materials soften, corners round, surfaces roughen. The ambition remains, but the technique does not keep pace. Architecture follows the same trajectory. Early dynastic construction favors massive blocks fitted without mortar. Later periods rely increasingly on smaller stones, rubble, fill, and binding agents to compensate for gaps. The scale shrinks, the tolerance widens, the engineering simplifies. This is not because Egypt ran out of stone. It is not because labor disappeared. Granite still lay in Aswan. Limestone still filled the plateau. Workers were still organized by the tens of thousands. What was missing was something less tangible, a way of working, a way of thinking, a discipline that allowed stone to be shaped as though it were soft, precise, obedient. Craft knowledge is fragile. Unlike myths or rituals, it cannot be preserved easily through repetition alone. It requires direct transmission. Master to apprentice. Eye to hand. Gesture to gesture. When that chain breaks even briefly, the loss can be permanent. You can remember that something was once possible without remembering how it was done. This explains the haunting quality of later Egyptian craftsmanship. Artisans knew what excellence looked like. They had examples before them, objects and structures left behind by earlier hands. But knowing the destination is not the same as knowing the path. Without the underlying technique, imitation becomes approximation, and approximation accumulates error. Each generation simplifies what it cannot fully reproduce. It chooses easier materials. It accepts wider tolerances. It compensates with mortar where stone once met stone. Over time, the form survives, but the finesse dissolves. This does not reflect decline in intelligence or creativity. It reflects the loss of a specialized tradition. When knowledge is inherited without being fully understood, it can endure briefly. It can even reach a peak. But once the last practitioners who truly grasp the method are gone, what remains is memory without instruction. And memory is not enough to rebuild mastery. The Egyptians were exceptional at preserving tradition. They maintained religious practices for millennia. They repeated artistic styles with remarkable consistency. They valued continuity above novelty, but continuity can also mask loss. When the purpose behind a technique fades, it becomes ritualized. When technique becomes ritual, it no longer evolves. Stoneworking appears to have followed this path. The earliest works are confident, exact, and daring. Later works are careful, conservative, and constrained. The culture remembers that stone matters, that precision matters, but not how to command it at the same level. This inversion is not limited to Egypt. It appears elsewhere in the ancient world, wherever advanced techniques are concentrated in small, fragile knowledge systems. But Egypt preserves the pattern unusually clearly because its monuments endure long enough for comparison. The stones themselves do not argue, they simply endure. And when endurance reveals that the past was sometimes more precise than the future, it forces a difficult question. If craftsmanship faded rather than improved, then the source of that craftsmanship may not lie where we expect it. It may belong to an earlier chapter 1 that Egypt inherited, expressed briefly, and then slowly let slip away. What remains is not failure, but echo. A civilization repeating forms whose original meaning has thinned, whose techniques have softened, whose brilliance still shines through stone, even as the hands that once shaped it disappear into time. Knowledge does not always disappear in fire or flood. Sometimes it fades quietly, generation by generation, until only the shape remains. If pyramid engineering was inherited rather than invented, then its disappearance begins to make a different kind of sense. Inherited knowledge behaves differently from discovered knowledge. It can be applied without being understood, repeated without being questioned, and preserved without being expanded. And when understanding is missing, improvement becomes impossible. This is the distinction that haunts Giza. The builders of the Fourth Dynasty clearly knew how to execute the design. They knew where to place the stones. They knew how to orient the structure. They knew which proportions mattered. But knowing how is not the same as knowing why. And when the why is lost, the how becomes brittle. Ritual is what remains when explanation vanishes. Across Egyptian culture, ritual preserved fragments of older understanding long after their original context had dissolved. A ceremony might require facing east at dawn, even when the astronomical reasoning behind that direction was no longer articulated. A proportion might be considered sacred without anyone remembering what physical principle it once expressed. Meaning survives as habit. Pyramid construction appears to follow this pattern. Later builders remembered that pyramids mattered. They remembered that alignment mattered. They remembered that stone must be placed carefully. But they no longer remembered the deeper system that bound these choices together into a coherent whole. This is why later pyramids resemble the Great Pyramid from a distance but fail upon closer inspection. The form is correct. The intention is sincere. But the internal logic is missing. Chambers crack. Stress accumulates. Materials compensate for uncertainty rather than eliminating it. Mortar fills gaps that precision once erased. The builders inherited the answer, but not the equation. This kind of loss does not require catastrophe. It does not require invasion or collapse. It requires only interruption. A generation of master craftsmen dies before fully training their successors. A tradition that relied on hands-on transmission is absorbed into bureaucracy. Skills that once required years of intimate apprenticeship are reduced to standardized tasks. Over time, what was once living knowledge becomes static procedure. The Egyptians were masters of administration. They excelled at organizing labor, tracking resources, and sustaining institutions across centuries. But administration is not innovation. It preserves systems. It does not necessarily deepen them. If pyramid engineering was never fully integrated into the scribal and educational framework, It could persist briefly and then vanish without leaving a written trace. This explains the peculiar selectivity of Egyptian texts. They record what could be counted, scheduled, and supervised. They do not record what required intuition, embodied skill, or abstract reasoning that had already begun to fade. The Diary of Mira tells us how stone moved. It tells us nothing about why those stones were shaped the way they were. Knowledge without memory leaves exactly this kind of record. The pyramid itself becomes the archive. Its measurements hold relationships. Its orientation preserves astronomical observation. Its structure demonstrates load distribution. These truths do not need explanation to function. They simply exist, encoded in stone, waiting for someone capable of reading them. Later generations could measure the pyramid. They could copy its angles. They could approximate its form. But without the conceptual framework that produced those measurements, replication becomes superficial. The builders knew that something important was embedded in the structure, but not what it was. This is how knowledge becomes sacred. Once understanding fades, questions stop being asked. The technique is no longer debated or improved. It is revered. Reverence freezes form. Innovation ceases. What was once engineering becomes tradition. And tradition, for all its power, does not teach you how to rebuild what you have lost. If the knowledge behind Giza was inherited from a time before writing, before institutions, before centralized education, then its disappearance is not mysterious at all. Oral and practical traditions can survive astonishingly long, but only as long as continuity is maintained. Break that continuity, and the knowledge collapses inward, leaving behind only the visible results. Stone outlasts memory. Form outlasts meaning. This is why the pyramids feel so final. Not because they were the ultimate achievement of Egyptian engineering, but because they were the last clear expression of something older. After them, the gestures continue, but the voice grows quieter. The hands still move, but with less certainty. By the time later dynasties looked back at Giza, they were already looking across a gulf. They could honor what stood before them. They could preserve it. But they could no longer summon the understanding required to create another. And so the pyramids became what inherited knowledge always becomes in the end. Not tools, but symbols. Not explanations, but questions. Not beginnings, but memories carved into stone, waiting for a future that might one day remember what the past forgot. Most human structures are built for use. A few are built for memory. The pyramids feel as though they were built for something else entirely. They are not efficient. They are not adaptable. They do not invite modification or reuse. Every aspect of their design resists change. Their mass anchors them. Their geometry stabilizes them. Their materials harden with time instead of weakening. Even stripped of their casing stones, even robbed, weathered, and scarred, they continue to stand exactly where they were placed, unmoved by centuries of neglect. This is not accidental durability. It is intentional permanence. The core blocks of the Great Pyramid are rough limestone, chosen not for beauty but for strength. Once exposed to air, limestone hardens, becoming more resistant to erosion. The casing stones, originally polished white limestone, formed a protective shell that shed rain and wind. Granite, nearly indestructible, was reserved for the most structurally critical spaces, the king's chamber and the relieving chambers above it where failure was not an option. These choices reveal a design philosophy that does not think in decades or dynasties. It thinks in geological time. The pyramid shape itself is inherently stable. Weight flows downward and outward. There are no unsupported spans, no fragile arches, no decorative excess. Stress distributes naturally. Redundancy is built in. Even the internal chambers are over-engineered, surrounded by layers of stone whose only purpose is to protect the void beneath. This is not how one builds a simple tomb. Ego might explain size. It does not explain invisibility. The most durable features of the Great Pyramid are hidden: the granite beams, the relieving chambers, the precise leveling of the base. These elements serve no aesthetic function. They exist for one reason only: to ensure survival, to guarantee that whatever this structure was meant to do, it would continue to do it long after its builders were gone. Why build like this unless you expect forgetting? Cultures that trust their knowledge to survive write it down. They pass it through schools, libraries, and institutions. But cultures that have witnessed collapse, fire, flood, silence begin to think differently. They stop trusting fragile systems. They seek materials that do not burn, that do not rot, that do not require interpretation to function. Stone does not need belief. Alignment does not need language. Geometry does not need memory. If the pyramids were designed by people who understood that civilizations fall and knowledge erodes, then encoding understanding into structure becomes a rational act. Not a message written in words, but one demonstrated in form. Not instructions, but examples. Not explanations, but proofs. Across history, this impulse appears again and again. Modern societies build seed vaults beneath mountains. They etch warnings into stone near nuclear waste sites. They design monuments meant to survive catastrophe. These projects are not expressions of confidence. They are expressions of humility, acknowledgements that continuity cannot be guaranteed. The pyramids feel like they were born of the same awareness. They do not tell us who built them. They do not tell us why. They do not even tell us what they were for. They simply remain. Empires rose and fell around them. Languages changed. Religions transformed. Climate shifted. And still they stand, aligned, measured, silent. By the time medieval explorers entered their passages, even Egypt had forgotten how they were made. The pyramids were already ancient mysteries, their origins debated, their purpose unclear. That, perhaps, was always the point. If the pyramids were inheritances rather than inventions, if they represent the last clear expression of an older knowledge system, then Egypt's role was not to originate them, but to preserve them, to carry them forward through time, to act as a bridge between a forgotten past and an uncertain future. This reframes everything. Human history no longer appears as a straight line of progress, but as a layered landscape of rise, loss, preservation, and rediscovery. Knowledge does not always move forward. Sometimes it survives by standing still, embedded in stone, waiting. The pyramids do not demand belief. They do not ask for myth. They ask only that we notice their order, their silence, their refusal to decay. They suggest that someone, at some point in the deep past, understood something worth preserving beyond memory itself and chose to preserve it in the only language that could survive forgetting: stone, sky, measure. And if that is true, then the greatest mystery of the pyramids is not who built them, but what they expected to happen next.